Hey, this is Ian, in with you in the fight back. Alright, last night I was actually reading on Rosa Luxemburg, and someone in my house was actually watching the television. So I kind of peeked up, see what's on, and there was some special on about Jackie Kennedy. Apparently, some interviews she had done had been released, so you got to, that had been hidden for so long, and now you could hear her in her own words about her husband, her time in the White House, all this kind of stuff. And I watched kind of for about 10 minutes, and I went back to what I was doing. Because if there's one thing that really annoys me, it's the whole cult, the mystique, or the myth, if you will, of JFK, of John F. Kennedy. Because a lot of what the interviews were about kept going back to JFK. Now, John F. Kennedy, for many people, there's this whole mystique about him. There's this whole notion of Camelot. It seems everything, it's like almost a celebrity worship, a celebrity cult, more than you'd find for almost any celebrity now. And it's kind of, so what do I think of this cult? Because I really don't. I'm not a big fan of John F. Kennedy, it has become very clear. So, John F. Kennedy, he's elected in like 1960. He's relatively young. He's in his 40s. He's handsome, good-looking, articulate, charming, if you will. He comes in with all these bold promises, the new frontier, about restoring the United States, about asking what you can do for your country. And the truth, and of course, he's assassinated in 1963, so about 48 years ago. And it seems to many, especially to many of the more liberal people, or many of those who are unformed politically but may have some, they look back at this about JFK as this great promise, this great man, articulate, who did all these great things supposedly when he was in office, like saving the world from nuclear war, about helping the civil rights movement, about putting the United States on the path to the moon. And he's tragically gunned down, and in the interim, in the almost 50 years since his death, we have conspiracy theories about why was this great, noble figure killed, and all of this. And furthermore, we have anything associated with Kennedy is just upheld. Whenever something even trivial about the Kennedys is in the news, not necessarily JFK, it's become front page headlines. And of course, depending on what part of the country you live, for instance, in Massachusetts, it's particularly bad because that's JFK's home state. And there's also Rhode Island. I would suspect the Kennedy cult is probably not as strong in Alabama, which I believe did not vote for JFK. But that aside, JFK, this whole mystique surrounding him, the truth is he was a scumbag. He was an anti-communist, mass-murdering reactionary. Why do I say that? Well, first of all, let's just look at domestic policy. He gave tax cuts to big business, as if these people need tax cuts anyway. One of his great domestic triumphs. As for the civil rights movement, it should be noted that I would probably put more trust in the actual activists, whether the Freedom Riders, Dr. King, Malcolm X, or any of the sit-ins or the demonstrations in, say, Birmingham, than I would in JFK. JFK was often facilitating, compromising. He really wasn't willing to back the civil rights demonstrators. He would condemn them for going too far, as it were, and maybe at the last minute to score political points, he would get on board. And supposedly after he died, a lot of civil rights legislation was passed. But the civil rights movement was not won in the halls of Congress. It was not won in the White House, whether by JFK or his successor, Lyndon Johnson. It was won in the streets, essentially. It was won through mass activism. So he really wasn't very much a friend of the civil rights movement. And as for the space program, well, maybe we should actually credit the people who actually did that, like the astronauts, the scientists, the engineers, and all of them. And even then, part of me thinks a lot of it was kind of to help the military, which is a definite no-no in my book. And of course, like every other president, he of course helped military spending. Now, let's go to another area of JFK, and that is foreign policy. Oh, this is good. This man was a reactionary piece of crap when it came to foreign policy. Just like every other U.S. president, whatever so-called differences they have on domestic policy, they're always pretty much in sync when it comes to foreign policy. Okay, we can name a few. Let's see. He set in motion the CIA that helped to overthrow the Brazilian democratically elected government. Granted, this coup happened after he died, but he kind of set it in motion, and brought in 20 years of military rule, so-called freedom and democracy to Brazil. Real nice guy. During the 60s in the Congo, there was a whole independence struggle there, a struggle for, a progressive nationalism, and, well, of course, Kennedy wasn't backing that. He was backing the more reactionaries, backing mercenaries who were coming in and doing all they could to keep Congo in a state of neo-colonial domination. Nice job. All right, what else? Oh, Cuba. Cuba's the big one. Of course, we have the Cuban Revolution before Kennedy comes into office in 1959, and by the time Kennedy's in office, the Cuban Revolution is well along. Firms have been nationalized, the population has been armed, popular power has been established, and the CIA is, of course, involved in subversion, and Kennedy is, of course, backs the Bay of Pigs invasion, where a bunch of reactionary scum who had been driven out of Cuba were coming back to invade and to reestablish U.S. domination on the island and to oust Fidel Castro. And Kennedy backs this. Now they could say, oh, he needed to do it to score points with the CIA. I didn't realize being in the presidency was some kind of pissing contest. But whatever. He very much supports these anti-communist scumbags. And of course, the Bay of Pigs doesn't go off as planned. I mean, of course, the Cuban government was watching them. It makes sense. Someone's planning an invasion of your country. You're probably actually going to have agents watching them. And the population is relatively mobilized, and they're able to pretty much back them out. And Kennedy isn't willing to take it the next step and to, potentially lead to war with the Soviet Union, which was kind of backing Castro at that point. So, and that gets him a lot of grief from a lot of anti-communists. Oh, he should have gone farther and all this. Well, Kennedy was willing to subvert an independent sovereign country that dared to defy U.S. interests and actually work for the benefit of its population. So what else did Kennedy do in this regard? Well, after the Bay of Pigs, the next big thing that's really headline on Kennedy is supposedly saving the world from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Some brief background, because it's a very complicated topic, is the end of 1961, then the beginning of 1962, a program was put in place called Operation Mongoose, approved by the CIA and, of course, the Kennedy administration, that was to pretty much destabilize the Cuban government. This calls for funding of armed groups, subversion, terrorism, yes, terrorism, sabotage, and all sorts of counter-revolution to helpfully destabilize Cuba and make it ripe for a U.S.-backed invasion. And, of course, in response to this, the country is being actively subverted by U.S. imperialism, backed by JFK to the hilt. So Fidel Castro kind of wants a deterrent to this. And he's telling the Soviet Union, how about some missiles here so they actually don't threaten us? And the Soviets actually, if we remember, whatever you think of Khrushchev or whatnot is irrelevant here. We have the Soviet Union, and right to its southern border is actually Turkey, which was a base which had a lot of U.S. nuclear weapons. So they were actually missiles at the doorstep of the Soviet Union. along with, of course, in Berlin or in West Germany as well. So suddenly this great Soviet provocation, well, it's actually almost evening the playing field, because just as there are missiles threatening the Soviet Union from Turkey, now there are missiles threatening Cuba, the United States from Cuba. But, yeah, there was a whole brinkmanship between Kennedy and Khrushchev, and the world didn't blow up and all of that. But Kennedy, of course, inactively trying to subvert and overthrow Cuba's popular Fidel Castro government, kind of brought a lot of that upon himself, or upon U.S. imperialism. And going even furthermore into the whole Kennedy myth from this point is, of course, the U.S. continues and still continues to this day to do whatever they can to subvert the Cuban government. And here's another one. I could go on foreign policy, but this one will suffice. In the 1960s, the United States is kind of beefing up its involvement in the neo-colonial state of South Vietnam, or the Republic of Vietnam. And they're backing the corrupt dictatorship Diem. They are setting up concentration camps. They are clearing out villages. They're sending in advisors. They're helping to massacre the population, backing this corrupt reactionary dictatorship. And during Kennedy's tenure in office, and supposedly, if you read some isolated statements, he supposedly was kind of wary about a lot of this, but he's still sending in more troops, sending in more advisors, and at one point they actually assassinate, right before Kennedy's killed, Diem. Diem is overthrown in a military coup, and it's almost seen because Diem had outlived his usefulness to U.S. imperialism, and a new military dictator is brought in. But the U.S. commitment to war in Vietnam was not in any way downgraded under Kennedy. In fact, it went up. And Kennedy, was responsible for a lot of that. Now, of course, Kennedy is killed, and there's a whole bunch of conspiracies about that. And that's probably because supposedly, if you look at Kennedy's successor, whether it's Lyndon Johnson, and with Democrats, Kennedy is almost a real shining beacon, because supposedly it was the promises unfulfilled of what he did during his tenure in office. Well, not really, because a lot of the mystique with Kennedy doesn't really exist with Bill Clinton, not to the same extent, and with Barack Obama, granted, it seemed like when he was running for office, there's a lot of mystique and a great deal of charisma associated with him, and they're making out like he was the next JFK and all of this. A lot of it has kind of worn off. It's worn thin at this point. But with Kennedy, since, he died so young, so tragically, supposedly this great mystique, and it's like, who would want to bring down this man who supposedly did all these great things? And a lot of it's, whitewashed the record I've shown for you. And, well, we have everybody from the CIA wanted to kill him, the Mafia wanted to kill him, the Russians, the Cubans. And I realized, because I actually have family who really care about the conspiracy surrounding JFK, and there's a movie by Oliver Stone called JFK, which goes into the whole conspiracy about his death. And I realized at a certain point, because I bothered to read a book that said the CIA killed Kennedy, I'm like, so I finished, and I realized I don't care. That sounds harsh, but I really don't care if there was a conspiracy surrounding Kennedy, because he was a scumbag. He was another reactionary U.S. imperialist, and I don't really care, because supposedly he wanted to abolish the Fed or something at one, and that was another reason supposedly people wanted to kill him. Like, I don't care. The stuff he did in Cuba, Vietnam, I don't really care. And of course, while he was in office, he was keeping FBI surveillance on leftists and the civil rights movement. And here's something else with foreign policy. You ever heard of the Alliance for Progress? In Latin America, after the Cuban Revolution, the United States feared New Cuba, so Kennedy proposes this Alliance for Progress, which is supposedly to modernize Latin America, to make its economies, develop, become and help the population when really all it's doing is beefing up military aid, it's supporting local oligarchs and all the lackeys of imperialism. Yeah, that's another great legacy of Kennedy. So this whole Camelot, for one thing, the United States claims to be a republic, a democracy, and all of this. Yet with Camelot, they're almost trying to create a royal dynasty. It's like, what is that? We, I mean, we don't need that. No one needs a royal dynasty. So Kennedy, I just the mystique about him is unearned, and the truth is, he really wasn't that great a guy.